Hi everybody, how are you all doing today? Good, I hope. This is the video for the introduction and overview to Steven Pinker's article, Language is a Human Instinct. So this text that you have printed out is from the website edge.org. Edge.org was founded in the 1990s, specifically actually in 1996, the same year that this article was published. So this is one of the first articles from their website. And it was a place where this intellectual group that was called Reality Club has transitioned their meetings and their conversations and their kind of scholarship from the traditional person-to-person, face-to-face kind of setting into the digital atmosphere. So they kind of were an intellectual group that met throughout the 1980s and 1990s. But then by the end of the 90s, all of their discussions were published in the online forum. So first of all, it expanded these topics for anybody to access. And then second of all, it allowed them to really keep a permanent record. The Reality Club was kind of driven by this motto that you see at the very top of our first page of the printout. It says, "To arrive at the edge of the world's knowledge, seek out the most complex and sophisticated minds. Put them in a room together and have them ask each other the questions that they are asking themselves." So we have this really theme of collaboration and group community to explore knowledge and ideas and thought. So this was a group of writers who really tried to push through the intellectual bounds. They merged so that the Reality Club merged with this concept called third culture, which is a culture that really embraces and takes place in the digital technological realm. So this collection of thinkers and writers kind of adopted this moniker of like the digerati, or people who like explore controversial, non-traditional ideas specifically surrounding digital culture. So that's a little introduction for like the context of where this writing is coming from, for where the publication comes from. The author himself, Steven Pinker, is he's a pretty famous academic and even pop cultural figure who is specifically in the field of cognitive neuroscience. So he's interested in studying the brain, and his special interest is studying the function of like language compartments in the brain. He's a figure who is mentioned and has been mentioned over the last 20 years, just in like news stories, on radio shows. So he's not just an academic who sort of like writes books and keeps to himself, but he is someone who's in the public eye more, similar to Noam Chomsky. In this article that we're looking at, Language is a Human Instinct, is written in 1996. So that's the same year from the reading that we had before from David Abrams. So these two are contemporaries of one another. And as we're getting into the reading, I just want to point out a couple of just details or like tasks. First of all, don't worry so much. It says that it's page 1 out of 17, but it stops like halfway through page 10. So really it's a 9-page reading, not 17 pages. The style of the writing itself uses tons and tons of metaphors and analogies, figurative language. So as you're reading, let's pay special attention to finding those metaphors. Usually in academic writing, metaphors and analogies is something that we want to avoid. because it's unclear. It doesn't help make your meaning explicit and clear to the reader. So keep your eye out for those and try and pause at each one and try and understand what is the point this author is getting at. And then secondly, the text is sort of broken down into 5 sections. So there's an introduction and a conclusion and 3 sections in between. And each section break is signaled by a rhetorical question. So you can kind of, when you get to that rhetorical question, you can be like, oh, okay, we're kind of switching gears. We're switching gears here. So that's a little bit just to look for and be aware of as we get started. So I will try and be quick as we go through this. I don't want to take up too much of your time before you read it. But if we open it up to what is page 2, the beginning of the article, we have a pretty nice textbook looking example of the thesis statement where we have the author's argument. We have some details for the sort of like claims that he's intending to make, and then we have a link to the larger significance. Right after that, we have a kind of a context position. So he's saying, right now in the, like what he's working on, he has some examples from a sport speech community and immigration speech community that help us get into his questions about how does language carry meaning the way that it does. And then we have this, the rest of this section is where he introduces the 3 key ideas that he uses in order to synthesize and understand the entire collection of ideas about language and meaning and humanity as far back as the 1950s up until the present, which for him is the 1990s. So he's kind of synthesizing about trying to synthesize about 45 years worth of ideas here in 3 concepts. And his concepts are, number 1, that language is an innate biological adaptation rather than a socio-cultural invention. So, we are getting familiar with that contrast between naturalist view of language and conventionalist view of language. So on the one hand, some people believe that language meaning is naturally connected between words and definitions, versus that language meaning was invented by conventional agreement. This is something a little bit different. This author isn't talking about the meaning of words, but about just the fact of language, that language exists. And he's saying that language wasn't necessarily invented by society, but it was actually innate and natural to human existence and evolution. Secondly, the second key idea is that language is not an accidental byproduct of evolution. Instead, language is a complex and innate adaptation. So it sounds like the same point again, but he's reiterating it and just doing a different contrast. And then in both of these sections, it's just a really excellent example of the writing technique that we talk about in this class, which is just building on that they say, I say argument structure, where you mention the context of your argument, so what other scholars have said, and then you mention what you are saying. So he has some really great examples on here. Page 2 of the text, which is, the first page we'll read, has a beautiful thesis introduction, some beautiful they say and I say claims. And then remember, we're looking at those 3 key ideas. So the next one is on page 3, and he uses these just really nice, clear signal terms. He says first, second, third. So then the third big idea is that language is relevant for everybody to study in every discipline. Especially for people who are interested in studying, how the mind works or how thought works, because language is pretty much our only function that makes what's inside of our head outside of our head. I might add to that. I might try to add to that art, like visual arts, can translate what's inside of our head and bring it outside to the forefront, much more clearly, of course, than musical art or dance art can. But language has that logic, that precision, that sort of that denotative level, that you can clearly express what's on the inside of you and bring it to the outside of you. And of course, as a cognitive neuroscientist, Steven Pinker is very much interested in how can we manifest the brain's functions through something like language that can be shared. And then he ends this section, so this would be our section 1 with the introduction, the 3 big ideas, and he ends this section with a key analogy, saying that the mind is kind of like a Swiss Army knife. So it's like a gadget that has all of these different functions to it, and language is one of those functions. And then we see our transition into section 2 has this rhetorical question. Why do I call language an instinct? So that's his thesis, was language is an instinct. It was conveniently right there in the title of the piece. And so he says that there are 4 kinds of evidence that he uses to support the idea that language is a human instinct. The first is that language is universal. All societies in the world have language. The second kind of evidence that he uses to say that language is an instinct is to say that not only is language universal across the globe, every single society has a sophisticated and complex grammar. And that grammar has some universal design elements. Steven Pinker says that all grammars, all languages have nouns, verbs, subjects, objects, cases and case agreement, auxiliary words, and vocabulary words, like their lexicon. Tens of thousands of words comprise the language. And he also makes this interesting sort of separation in this paragraph here. He separates, first of all, prescriptive grammar, which is rules of grammar, from what he wants to talk about, which is descriptive grammar, or live action language as it's used on the ground in real time. So that's descriptive grammar, just describes the way people actually use language, as opposed to prescriptive grammar, which tells you what the rules should be. And then, so he tells you, like, that has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. I don't mean this, but what I do mean is this other idea. So that's an interesting move to help really clarify your ideas in your writing, is to say, don't get confused because I'm not talking about X. I'm talking about Y. Okay, and then number 3, so the third kind of evidence that he uses, he expands on a lot because he's most interested in it. That children develop language skills rapidly and in about the same order, no matter what culture they grow up in. So universal acquisition of grammar and language. Saying, like little babies like babble and make those, babbling noises. And then around age 2.5 to 3, they sort of just burst and explode into language, where you can actually talk to them and they can communicate with you. He compares toddler language and the complexity and the skill of that to artificial intelligence and computer language trying to mimic language. And he's talking about 1996. He's saying that the problem that children seem to be able to solve, which is to take examples of sentences over a couple of years and then burst them all together into a program that makes sense. Like children can solve this problem, but that is way beyond the capabilities of any current artificial intelligence systems. Current natural language processing systems can't even use one single language, let alone learn to use a language. Like they can't even use a language that's programmed into them, and they don't have a shot at learning a language. Like for example, but I kind of wanted to ask if any of you guys are those computer science scholars and students out there. Maybe you can update us on this. In the past 20 years, how have these things changed? Or 25 years? How has the development in, like artificial intelligence language systems changed? So for example, I know that we can talk to Alexa and Bixby and Cortana and Siri, like on our phones and computers and tablets. We can talk to that system, and that system can talk back to us. So maybe there's something that you guys can offer to update this argument and these examples that Steven Pinker brings up. Anyways, he goes on about this claim number 3, the third kind of evidence. Children are good at avoiding errors in language. Children use this kind of common sense, which is much more reasonable and much more logical than the actual prescriptive rules of grammar. So for example, when they are learning the tenses, they'll say like, I cutted my hair, or like, I putted that cup away. So they'll say these, they're actually wrong past tense words. But Steven Pinker is saying, yeah, they might be wrong, but these children are giving us much more precise, much more accurate descriptions and clarity of language. It disambiguifies. It makes it less ambiguous. I cut my hair. Are you saying like, right now you cut your hair, yesterday you cut your hair, but if you say I cutted my hair, it's very clear that already happened, etc. So there's examples like that. And then I love this quote when he's talking about, like children seem to have this common sense that is more reasonable than language, than the rules of grammar. And then he says, but an unconscious program synchronizes the child's language with the language of the community. So they overcome those sort of more accurate flaws in language in order to fit in with their social environment. And then he talks about a couple of different examples of language. So he talks about creolization, which was in the context of the children of plantation slave colonies in the 1617, early 1800s of the United States, or also in the Caribbean, in other like French or English colonies as well. But there's what they called pidgin, which, I wouldn't say that pidgin is the correct word to use in our contemporary context, but it's a creolized language, so a mixed and blended language. And he also talks about the example of Nicaraguan Sign Language, when deaf children in Nicaragua sort of made up and invented their own language and grammar, because that language didn't have a sign system. And in all of these examples, there are complex universal grammar rules. And his major point, his overall point in the third kind of evidence that children all develop grammar, he was kind of saying that, I guess the underlying point is he's kind of saying that children have a way of adding complexity and detail and precision to language, but that that complexity and detail and precision is really dulled by social convention, which tells them this is right and this is wrong. It reminds me of what Welby was talking about in the beginning of the term. Okay, for the fourth bit of evidence that he uses to support his claim that language is an instinct, saying that language has a specific place in the brain. Language is its own mental system. And then he kind of uses another analogy. He says that the brain is not a meatloaf. So he's saying it's not just like a lump where there's like, the bigger it is, the smarter you are, and the smaller it is, the dumber you are. He's saying it's not like that. It's like, here are the pieces of your brain and they each do something. So it's compartmentalized. He says the brain fractionates into subcomponents. And then he supports this fourth type of evidence. He supports it with some examples. He says there's aphasia is like brain damage from a stroke, and you can have a lost ability to speak if that specific portion of your brain is impaired. If it's in another portion of your brain, your language abilities will not be impaired. Therefore, we can deduce that language has a place in the brain. He also says that there are some conditions called specific language impairment, where some people just, cannot use language, although they have high levels of intelligence otherwise, so like mathematical reasoning, tactile skills, etc. Not connected to language. So there's one system of the brain that is impaired and other systems of the brain are doing great. It's not just like, I have a big brain, so I'm good at language, or I have a small brain, so I'm bad at it. We might take that idea for granted because it's 2020. And cognitive neuroscience is really easy to read about. But for his time, he's informing people of these ideas. Language impairment can run in families. And then there's this on page 6 of 17 of page 6, he says, just because of those two examples that I gave before, that's not really enough to prove my point. So we'll talk about people who have maybe are on the autism spectrum, who are really smart at a lot of different things, but they can't use language very well. And then he uses some, honestly, I don't know if in 1996, if this was offensive or not, but he says, he uses words like idiot, savant, and retarded in his article. So I think, we can think about the offensiveness of this kind of language, at least for our moment. And we can talk about the mutability of those words and how we can really change whether or not those can be socially acceptable words to use. Anyway, so he closes off this section about how language is a separate mental system, an instinct that was evolved through adaptation. And then he transitions us into part 3 with another rhetorical question. He says, why do I call language an adaptation? So the previous section was, why do I call language an instinct? And now we're looking at, why do I call language an adaptation? And so he contrasts two key ideas. One is a byproduct of evolution, and one is a specific evolutionary adaptation. And he uses this example of saying, we evolved and adapted to have strong bones made out of calcium. We didn't evolve and adapt to have white bones. The color of your bones wasn't the choice for evolution. It was the strength. The strength came from the mineral of calcium. The whiteness color is just a byproduct. And then he says, Some people, so some scholars, they say, people like Chomsky and Gold say that actually the adaptation that we developed was a large brain with analytical processing and hemispheric specialization. That was the real adaptation. The ability to analyze and solve problems, the ability to separate left hemisphere versus right hemisphere, which actually that hemispherization theory is really becoming unraveled in recent science. So even at that point, we are reading an outdated article that's 25 years old. It's just a little more up to date than what we have been reading, things that are 100 or 50 years old. Anyways, moving on. So he is saying, they say that what we really needed was analytical processing. And then he gives a criteria for biology that you can use to decide whether something is natural selection, which would be an adaptation, or whether it is just a byproduct of something else. So he talks about that criteria that you can use for biology, and then he extends that criteria to use it toward language. And he refers to George Williams and Richard Dawkins and comes up to the conclusion that language is a complex adaptive design. I'm not sure if his connections are really valid and sound right here. So maybe we can discuss whether we think he's making some fallacies, some hasty generalizations, whether he's, missing some connections between the evidence he's talking about and the claims he's coming to. But then, so as we turn from page 6 to page 7, we'll see this, the watch analogy. He's saying, a watch is something with a complex design. So its existence implies that there was somebody to design that watch. And the old argument used to go, must have been God. God is, akin to the human designer, since humans are so complex. Just as a watchmaker is akin to the existence of a watch. The eye is a complex tool, so there must be an eye maker out there, and let's point to God for that. And then he says that, Darwin comes along and sort of shakes up that foundation in theology. And he says, actually we can theorize that there is a physical process through natural selection, which increases the likelihood of well-functioning eyes being distributed from one member to the next in the species. So that's how he, through those analogies and comparisons and narrative stories, he says, I have applied the test of natural selection and adaptation from biology to language. He says he's going to do that. So then he says that, so in biology, if something is improbable and complex, it's most likely a product of natural selection. And then he gives us 6 examples for why language is improbable and complex. He talks about our humongous dictionary of words that we just keep in our head. We just know millions of words. Well, I don't know if it's millions, but it's a lot of words. He says we just know and understand syntax, which is how we order the words to create coherent, meaningful sentences. The rules of morphology, which is how word parts can be, separated and combined. Phonology, how word sounds can be separated or combined. Mechanisms for how to produce speech from your body. So like your larynx, your tongue, your soft palate, your esophagus, the way that you can't speak and breathe at the same time. You can't swallow and speak at the same time. You can't swallow and breathe at the same time. And this physiology comes up again in the reading that we will do soon, which is from Benjamin Hale. He also talks about the shape basically of right here. And then, so the sixth one is then also speech perception. Like we have mechanisms, to decode the meaning of speech sounds. We're going to read a text from Octavia Butler, also coming up soon, which is called Speech Sounds. How our ears have a mechanism to decode speech sounds much more quickly than we can decode other sounds from the natural world. So those 6 reasons are why our language mechanisms are improbable and complex. And then he gives us a few reasons for why our speech mechanisms are adaptive. He says that we use language to share information, which increases our likelihood of survival and reproduction. He says that we use language to organize social relations and to determine the value of members of our society. He says that in every human society, we value people who are articulate and persuasive. Which sets up a pressure, an evolutionary and a survival-based pressure for using language with more skill. So whether we agree or disagree with what this author is saying, he's sort of given us this argument for why language is an adaptation as opposed to a byproduct. And he has, done his best to apply a standard set of criteria from biology, which is one discipline, into language, which is a separate discipline, though this author is linking those 2 disciplines. He says, okay, so that's my reasoning, and we're looking at page 8 still. He says, that's my reasoning, but let me check my work. So, you do a math problem, you add it all up, and then you subtract it back to see if you've done it correctly. He says, let's just make sure that I'm not wrong about the meatloaf analogy. So the size versus the compartments idea that he had. And he said, I'm going to think about dwarfs, which are a natural, normal variation that appears in the human species. So sometimes we have dwarf members of our species, and by volume their brains are smaller than full size people's brains. However, there's no difference between the function, because it's not the size of the brain that matters, it's the organization of the components. Which, when you think about it, that is kind of interesting. Maybe it's kind of interesting. But brain shape, not brain shape, but organization of the components of what happened, your mental software, which is another analogy that the author uses a lot, is what dictates your language ability, your mental abilities. And then he has this other example that he brings up, which is kind of startling. Until I read this article, I'd never heard of this condition, but there's a condition where your brain, he says the brain meat, I guess, the material, can line around the inside of your skull. He says similar to the meat of a coconut, how it lines around the inside of the coconut husk. He says that there was an example of a student at Oxford who had that condition in his brain, perfectly functioning individual, just that different shape. So he says, just to be sure, size and shape have nothing to do with language ability. And then he suggests, right before we move on, he suggests that maybe a lot of the confusion surrounding whether language is an adaptation or a byproduct is because we're really biased toward language. We care a lot about it. We have strong feelings about it, which, that's nice to hear. Okay, so part 4, we can see that he's signaling us into another subtopic by his rhetorical question. He says, what about the rest of the mind? This is a short question, but we're moving less from language and more into intellect in general. So he gives us a sort of summary of this nature versus nurture debate, saying, talking a little bit about this. He calls it the specter of biological determinism, which was an ideology of the early 20th century, kind of saying that different biological categories or groups, or what people call as races, were significantly different from one another. And that kind of ideology led to racism, sexism. Honestly, it led to the Holocaust, to World War II, to a lot of justifications for slavery. So biological determinism has never been a productive and wholesome, I guess, viewpoint. Let's see. And he's talking about saying, actually the nature versus nurture debate brings to the forefront the biological determinism is false, because you can take a person from any environment, like any race of person, whoever has like any different heritage of a person, you can adopt that person into a family of a different culture, and that person will grow up based on the culture, not based on some genetic differences that they had. We're getting away from like language based, more into historical, political content. So he says that in polite intellectual discourse, the politically correct position is that the mind is a lump of wax or a blank slate. So kind of like anybody's mind can have any potential. So I guess like equal opportunity cognitive development. And then he says that there were two ideas from anthropology and psychology, two ideas throughout history that have been really discredited over time. So the first one was to his next move is to destabilize this idea from anthropology, which is to say that human cultures are exaggeratedly different, like vastly different. You can't even compare them, to where they're almost not even the same species of creature anymore. Like early 20th century anthropology really focused on exoticism, exaggerating the differences between human groups, just to kind of, in one way, to really like justify the existence of their study. Like, oh, look at me, look at this amazing and unique discovery that I've made of this population group. Whereas in Pinker's view, he says that he takes a more structuralist view and says that actually there were a greater number of similarities across these cultures that people were just maybe too shocked to realize. And he says, besides language existing in all these cultures, every single culture has, humor, love, jealousy, responsibility, ethics, etc. And then he destabilizes the second concept, which comes from psychology, which was the idea, he said, was that the brain is a general all-purpose learning mechanism. And then on page 9, he says, the main discovery of cognitive science and artificial intelligence is that ordinary people are apt to be blasé about abilities that are, upon closer examination, remarkable engineering feats, like seeing in color, picking up a pencil, walking, talking, recognizing a face, and reasoning in ordinary conversation. These are fantastically complex tasks that require their own special kinds of software. So the brain isn't just a lump that can learn. It has those components and those compartments. Each component, each compartment does its task. And I'm not sure if that has stood the test of time and if that is, true to the facts. So maybe knows, and you can, clear us up on that. But instead of being like a lump or just a general purpose mechanism, he says the brain is like a toolbox. So we have another analogy, another metaphor. The brain is like a box of tools, and each tool can do its own task. And like he ends that argument there with that image. But it makes me think earlier he was telling us that I guess it's the same. Like he was telling us that like the brain is like a Swiss Army knife, not like a lump of meatloaf. So like it's one tool, but I guess the tool has many tools in it. So it does kind of go along with the toolbox analogy. At first I thought maybe he was like contradicting himself, but I can see how it's the same. Maybe we'll discuss further. All right, and then we go on to part 5, which is the conclusion, and we get the signal rhetorical question. If language is innate, then how much else is innate? Is innateness a slippery slope? And then he summarizes the context that he's been referring to: psychology, linguistics, artificial intelligence, flipping to the back. And then he leaves us with this kind of interesting idea that not just language processing, but all of these other types of processing and reasoning might have innate components inside the brain's toolbox. So we maybe have an intuitive sense of mechanics, intuitive sense of biology, an intuitive sense of number, an intuitive sense of mental mapping, danger, food intuitions, an intuitive sense of health and well-being, an intuitive sense of psychology, a mental Rolodex in which we store knowledge about other people, a sense of self, so the concept of like myself, and then a sense of like justice and rights, a sense of kinship and belonging. So he ends us with his final remark to, keep the audience thinking. He says, so with regard to the question, why should we care so much about language? One answer might be that language is a human intellectual instinct. And there might be many more. So he finishes out his argument that language is a human instinct, which is the title. And then he tells us, let's keep thinking about what other kinds of mechanisms might be instinctive, keeping the audience thinking. So that is our reading for today. If you have any questions or want to leave any comments, especially like if you know some background information about some of these topics that we've talked about, please reply in the comments below, so we can start to kind of get our ideas flowing a little bit before we go into reading the text. All right, see you guys next time.